What would you do if your own neighbors called the cops on you for floating a boat in your own lake? Cornell Dupree didn't just answer that question. He bought the very marina they depended on and flipped their world upside down. Imagine owning a piece of land that has been in your hands for years. You've paid the taxes, walked every inch of soil, and cared for it as if it were part of your family. Now picture this. You push a small boat into your own lake, ready for a slow afternoon of fishing, when patrol lights flash behind you as if you were a criminal caught in the act. That was the reality for Cornell Dupree, a 46-year-old rancher in northern Texas. Cornell wasn't flashy. He didn't live in a mansion or drive a sports car. His pride was in his ranch, a stretch of Texas land where the grass rolled out wide and the oak trees leaned toward the water. The lake was his favorite part. It wasn't a giant tourist attraction, just a quiet body of water tucked into his property, the kind of place where he could lose track of time with a rod in hand. That morning, the sun burned bright but gentle, the kind of day that made the air shimmer off the metal of his flat-bottom boat. Cornell lowered it into the water, the boat scraping lightly against the mud at the edge of the lake. He untied the rope, pushed with his boots, and drifted slowly away from shore. The ranch behind him grew smaller, and the water reflected back the wide Texas sky. Cornell had fished that lake dozens of times. Catfish, bass, sometimes even snapping turtles if he wasn't careful. It was his land, his water, his peace. He leaned back, letting the boat rock gently, when a sound cut through the stillness. Sirens. At first, he thought maybe they were racing down the highway beyond the ranch, but the wail grew closer, sharper, until the red and blue lights appeared near the subdivision's marina across the water. His stomach sank. 2 sheriff's deputies stepped out, scanning the lake. Behind them, a cluster of neighbors gathered, some with phones already recording, others whispering, their hands shading their eyes. And there, front and center, stood Janice Kettering, clipboard tucked against her side like a badge of authority. Janice was the president of the subdivision's homeowners association. She was in her late 50s, known for her tight schedule of rules and fines. She didn't own the lake, not even close, but she carried herself as if she ran the entire county. One of the deputies cupped his hands and shouted across the water, "Sir, we're going to need you to come in for a moment." Cornell stared at them, oar still in his hands. "This is my lake," he called back, voice steady, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Janice stepped forward, raising her voice over his. "That water belongs to the subdivision. You can't just use it like you own the place." Cornell felt heat rush to his face. He pulled the oar and guided his boat back toward shore. Gravel crunched under the deputy's boots as they walked closer. "Mind showing us some ID?" one deputy asked, polite but firm. Cornell nodded, reaching into his pocket. He handed it over, the weight of a dozen eyes burning into his back. He could hear snippets from the crowd. "Who even is he? Doesn't look like he lives here. Get this on video." He straightened up, lifting his chin. "This lake is on my deed. My ranch line runs straight through here. I've got the paperwork to prove it." The deputy looked at Janice. She stiffened. "That's not what our records say." Cornell locked eyes with her. "Records or not, I know what I bought, and you don't have the right to call me a trespasser on my own property." The silence stretched. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the deputy handed back his ID. "Sir, if you've got the deed, then you're within your rights." "Ma'am," he turned to Janice, "unless there's evidence otherwise, there's no violation here." Janice pressed her lips tight, but she didn't back down. She scribbled something on her clipboard, muttering, "We'll see about that." Cornell walked back to his boat, hands trembling, not from fear, but from humiliation. He had been made to defend himself like a stranger, in front of neighbors he didn't know, on land that was his by law and by right. Cameras were still pointed at him as he shoved his boat back into the water. The peace he had sought that morning was gone. He didn't say another word. But the sting dug deep, and Cornell knew this wasn't over. But what Cornell didn't realize was that this confrontation was just the beginning of a much bigger battle that would flip the neighborhood on its head. Cornell didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashing patrol lights bouncing off the water, heard the murmurs of the crowd, and felt the sharp sting of being treated like a trespasser. He had lived in Texas long enough to know that land was everything. People fought over it, inherited it, and built their lives around it. Owning land was more than a title. It was dignity. And yesterday, in front of half the neighborhood, his dignity had been dragged through the mud. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring out at the lake through the window. The mist rose off the surface, calm and inviting. But the thought of pushing his boat out there again made his stomach knot. His wife, Sharon Dupree, set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. "You going back out there today?" she asked gently. Cornell shook his head. "Not today. I don't feel like giving them another show." Sharon sat across from him. "Cornell, you did nothing wrong. That lake's ours. They made fools of themselves, not you." "Maybe so," Cornell said, stirring his coffee slowly. "But when the deputies show up because someone thinks you don't belong, it sticks with you. People recorded it. You think they'll post the part where I showed my deed? No. They'll post me standing there like I needed permission." Sharon reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Then you stand taller. Show them who you are." Cornell sighed. He wanted to believe her. But his mind kept going back to Janice Kettering's glare and the way the crowd muttered as if he were an intruder. Later that week, Cornell drove into town for feed and supplies. As he loaded sacks of grain into the bed of his truck outside the hardware store, a neighbor from the subdivision, Franklin Yates, walked up. Franklin was in his 60s, sun-weathered, wearing a fishing hat that looked older than Cornell. "Cornell," Franklin said, leaning against the truck bed. "Heard about what happened down at the lake." Cornell tightened the tie on one of the sacks. "I'm sure everyone heard." Franklin gave a small chuckle. "Yeah, word travels fast. Listen, I know Janice. She likes to run her mouth more than she should. Don't take it personal." Cornell looked him square in the eye. "How am I supposed to take it? She called the cops on me in my own water." Franklin nodded slowly. "Fair point. But you know how these HOA types are. Rules make them feel powerful. She's been running that subdivision like her own kingdom for years. People go along with it because most don't want the trouble." Cornell crossed his arms. "So they just let her decide who belongs and who doesn't." "Pretty much," Franklin shrugged. "But between you and me, she doesn't speak for everybody. Not everyone agreed with her pulling that stunt." Cornell studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good to hear at least one person's got sense." Franklin tipped his hat and walked off, leaving Cornell with the thought that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in that crowd saw him as an outsider. Still, the memory stuck. A week later, Cornell had to meet with the sheriff's office to formally present his deed, just to close out the report. In the deputy's office, he laid the paperwork flat on the desk, his name in bold letters at the top, the boundary lines clear as day. The deputy scanned it, then leaned back. "Looks like it checks out. You're in the clear, Mr. Dupree. Sorry for the inconvenience." Cornell didn't smile. "Inconvenience is when a package shows up late. This was humiliation. Out there in front of everyone, treated like I didn't belong." The deputy cleared his throat. "I get it. But sometimes folks make calls thinking they're protecting their neighborhood. Misunderstandings happen." Cornell folded the deed back into its envelope. "Misunderstandings don't end with patrol cars pulling up on you when you're trying to fish in your own lake. That wasn't protection. That was harassment." The deputy didn't answer. Cornell stood, sliding the envelope under his arm. He had made his point. Driving back to the ranch, he replayed everything in his head. The sirens, Janice's words, the crowd. Something shifted inside him. He wasn't angry in the way that boiled over. He was angry in the way that made you think long and hard about what to do next. When he pulled into his driveway, Sharon was outside tending to the garden. She looked up as he parked. "Well?" she asked. Cornell stepped out, brushing dust from his jeans. "They closed the case. Said the deed makes it clear." Sharon smiled faintly. "Good. That's done then." Cornell looked past her to the lake, its surface calm and glistening in the afternoon light. "No," he said quietly. "It's not done. Not by a long shot." But Cornell's quiet determination was about to steer him toward an idea that would shake the entire neighborhood in ways no one could predict. Cornell avoided the lake for the next several days, but the story followed him everywhere. It didn't matter if he was buying hay, stopping for gas, or just walking into the feed store. Someone always had a comment. Some folks spoke in whispers as he passed. Others came right up with awkward half-smiles and questions. At the grocery store in Denton, a woman he barely knew from church stopped him by the produce aisle. "Cornell, I saw that video on Facebook. I couldn't believe it. I mean, you handled yourself real calm, but goodness, people were talking." Cornell tightened his grip on the shopping cart. "Talking about what?" She lowered her voice, glancing around. "About whether you even owned the lake. People said the HOA wouldn't have called if they weren't sure." Cornell's jaw clenched. "I've got the deed. That lake's mine. Clear as day." "I believe you," she said quickly. "But you know how people are. Once something's online, it takes a life of its own." Cornell nodded stiffly and moved on, tossing potatoes into the cart just to get out of the conversation. That night, Sharon showed him her phone. "Look at this." Someone had uploaded a clip to a community Facebook group. It showed Cornell rowing back to shore with deputies waiting. The caption read, "Local man argues with HOA over restricted lake use." Sharon shook her head. "They made it sound like you were the one causing trouble." Cornell stared at the screen. The video had over 1,000 views, dozens of comments. Some defended him, but others weren't so kind. Typical. Rules are rules. Why make a scene if he didn't have something to hide? "Looks like someone doesn't know the HOA runs things around here." Cornell set the phone down slowly. "Doesn't matter how much paperwork you hold in your hand, people see what they want to see." The weight of it pressed on him. He had worked his whole life for this land. Long days hauling fence posts, fixing irrigation, hauling hay under the punishing Texas sun. And yet, in a matter of minutes, strangers could frame him as some trespasser, and the crowd would run with it. A few days later, his daughter Leah Dupree, who was in college in Fort Worth, called him. "Dad, I saw that video. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, trying to sound steady. "It didn't look fine." Leah pressed. "Why would they even call the police? That's your property." Cornell hesitated, staring out the window at the lake. "Because some people don't like what they can't control." There was silence on the line. Then Leah spoke softly. "You've always told me respect comes from how you carry yourself. You carried yourself right, Dad. Don't let them take that from you." Cornell swallowed hard. "I'll remember that." But still, humiliation sat heavy. The following weekend, Cornell drove past the subdivision Marina. He slowed his truck as he saw families hauling coolers and rods, kids laughing as they hurried toward their boats. Janice Kettering stood on the dock, clipboard in hand, nodding as if she were the commander of it all. Cornell pulled over for a moment, watching. That lake stretched into his property, but it was clear the HOA treated it as their crown jewel. He felt the sting again, how quickly they had tried to erase him from the picture. That night, Sharon found him sitting on the porch, staring out over the water. "You're quiet," she said, pulling a chair beside him. Cornell leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They think they can write me out, like I don't belong in what I built with my own hands." Sharon rested her hand on his shoulder. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Cornell didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the lake, the moonlight rippling across it. Finally, he spoke, low and firm, "Something they won't forget." But before Cornell could act, he needed to know more. And what he was about to learn about the HOA's prized Marina would open the door to a plan no one saw coming. Cornell's plan didn't form all at once. It started with a passing comment he overheard one afternoon at the feed store. He was paying at the counter when two men in line behind him started talking about the subdivision Marina. "You hear the docks are falling apart again?" one said, shaking his head. "Yeah," the other replied. "Our HOA keeps saying they'll fix it, but truth is they don't own it outright. Belongs to some old guy out in Gainesville. They just lease the slips." Cornell froze, pretending to fumble for change in his pocket. The conversation was casual, but it landed heavy. The HOA didn't own the Marina? That clipboard Janice carried, the authority she wore like armor, it wasn't backed by ownership. He drove home with the thought circling like a hawk overhead. After supper, he brought it up to Sharon. "You know that Marina?" he said, leaning back in his chair. What about it? She asked, pouring herself sweet tea. They don't own it. It belongs to someone else. HOA just leases the slips for residents. Sharon raised her eyebrows. And how'd you find that out? Feed store gossip, Cornell admitted. But it makes sense. They don't have the money to maintain something that big. Not with the way Janice runs things. Sharon studied him for a moment, then set the glass down. Why do I get the feeling you're not just telling me this for fun? Cornell smiled faintly. Because I'm not. That night, he sat at his desk, pulling out a notepad. He wrote down every angle. Ownership, finances, possible sale. His mind worked steady, not out of anger, but out of something colder. Resolve. The next morning, he drove to the county clerk's office in Denton. The building smelled of paper and dust, with rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals. Cornell approached the clerk, a middle-aged man with reading glasses perched low on his nose. "Can I help you?" The clerk asked. "I need ownership records for the Lakeside Marina on Highway 377, Cornell said. The clerk typed for a few moments, then pulled a file from the cabinet. "Here we go. Marina's owned by a Mr. Raymond Lockhart, out of Gainesville. Been in his name about 15 years. Cornell leaned forward. "Any record of liens? Debts?" The clerk scanned the page. "Looks like property taxes were late last year. Nothing major, but it's on file. You interested in buying?" Cornell kept his voice neutral. "Just curious." But as he left the office, the idea burned hotter. If Lockhart was behind, maybe he was tired of the place. Maybe he'd sell. And if Cornell bought it, the HOA wouldn't just lose its leverage. They'd have to answer to him. That evening, Cornell called an old friend, Victor Green, who worked in real estate. They met at a diner just off I-35, the kind of place with vinyl booths and pie that tasted like it had been sitting since noon. Victor slid into the booth, sipping his coffee. "So, what's on your mind, Cornell?" Cornell leaned in. "You know Raymond Lockhart?" Victor chuckled. "Everyone in Gainesville knows Ray. Owns that marina, or at least what's left of it. Why?" "I'm thinking about buying," Cornell said. Victor raised an eyebrow. "Buying? That marina's a headache. Docks are rotting, insurance is high, and Ray's been trying to unload it for years. HOA keeps it afloat with slip fees." Cornell didn't flinch. "What would it take?" Victor leaned back, considering. "Depends on how desperate Ray is. If you're serious, I can make a call. But Cornell, why would you want that mess?" Cornell's eyes hardened. "Because some people need reminding that respect isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes it's bought." Victor studied him, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll reach out." As Cornell drove back to the ranch, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not humiliation, not anger, but control. But calling the owner was only the first step. Cornell still had to sit across from him, lay his cards on the table, and prove he was the man to take the marina off his hands. The following week, Victor called with news. "Raymond Lockhart's willing to meet. Says he'll talk numbers if you're serious. He's at his place near Gainesville, out by the state park. You free this Friday?" Cornell didn't hesitate. "Tell him I'll be there." Friday afternoon, Cornell drove north, the road stretching flat and wide under a sky that looked endless. His old Chevy rumbled steady, dust trailing behind as he left Denton County and rolled into Gainesville. Lockhart's house wasn't anything fancy, an aging brick ranch-style home with a front porch sagging slightly at the middle. A faded boat trailer sat rusting in the driveway. Raymond Lockhart was waiting outside, a tall, wiry man in his 70s with a grey beard and calloused hands that told their own story. He waved Cornell over as Victor stepped out of his own truck behind him. "You must be Dupree," Lockhart said, his voice gravelly. "Heard you've got interest in my headache down on the lake." Cornell shook his hand firmly. "I heard you've been trying to sell for a while." Lockhart smirked, motioning toward a couple of lawn chairs on the porch. "Trying, yeah. But people want shiny and new. My marina's neither. Docks are rotting, insurance eats half the profit, and every year it feels like more trouble than it's worth. Sit down." They all took seats, the porch creaking under their weight. Lockhart lit a cigarette, squinting against the afternoon sun. "So why you?" he asked, exhaling smoke. "Most folks who come sniffing around are developers wanting to tear it all down for condos. You don't look like the condo type. Cornell leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Because I know the value of what you've got, not in shiny wood planks or fresh paint, but in location. That marina feeds into the subdivision, and those folks rely on it. You own their gateway to the water. Lockhart chuckled dryly. Spoken like a man who's been watching. But I'll be straight with you. HOA keeps the place going. Without their lease money, the marina's worthless. Cornell didn't blink. Then I'll keep leasing to them, but under my terms. Lockhart tapped his cigarette on the ashtray balanced on the arm of the chair. You don't strike me as someone who wants to babysit a marina. What's your angle? Cornell met his eyes. Respect. 2 weeks ago, the HOA called the cops on me while I was fishing my own lake. Treated me like an intruder on my land. If I buy your marina, I don't just gain property, I gain the leverage to make sure they never try that again. Lockhart let out a low whistle, then leaned back, studying Cornell like a man weighing a horse at auction. Finally, he smiled faintly. I like honesty. Better than the smooth talk I usually get. So, let's talk numbers. Victor pulled out a folder, flipping through comps and market estimates. Lockhart set his price higher than Cornell expected, but not unreasonable. The docks needed repairs, yes, but the land itself, prime lakeside frontage, held value. Cornell didn't haggle much. He knew dragging it out could spook the deal. Instead, he made a counteroffer just low enough to show he was serious, but fair enough to keep Lockhart interested. Lockhart took a long drag of his cigarette, then stubbed it out. You come back with financing in 30 days, it's yours. Otherwise, I'm done trying to sell. Cornell extended his hand again. Deal. Lockhart shook it, grip rough, but steady. Deal. On the drive home, Victor glanced at him from the passenger seat. You really going through with this? It's going to take cash, repairs, maybe even lawsuits down the line if the HOA pushes back. Cornell kept his eyes on the road. I've worked my whole life for this ranch. They tried to strip me of my dignity in front of the whole county. I'm not backing down now. Victor let out a slow breath. Then let's get your financing lined up. That night, Sharon listened carefully as Cornell told her everything. She didn't interrupt, just sat across from him at the kitchen table. When he finished, she leaned back, arms crossed. Cornell, this isn't just about fishing anymore, is it? He shook his head. No, it's about drawing a line. They thought they could erase me from my own lake. I'm going to remind them who really holds the keys. Sharon was quiet, then finally nodded. Then do it. But do it smart. Cornell smiled faintly. That's the only way I know how. But while the deal was inching forward, whispers were already spreading through the subdivision. And once word reached Janice Kettering, the quiet battle was about to get a whole lot louder. The deal closed faster than anyone expected. Cornell kept quiet during the process, only looping in Victor and Sharon. 30 days of paperwork, phone calls, and a trip to the bank later, the marina on Highway 377 officially belonged to Cornell Dupree. He didn't announce it. He didn't boast. But word has a way of traveling in small towns, and it didn't take long before the subdivision found out. Cornell was standing in the feed store when Franklin Yates spotted him. Well, I'll be damned, Franklin said with a half-smile. Heard you bought the marina? Cornell raised an eyebrow. Word spreads quick. Quick? Franklin laughed. It's all anyone's talking about in the subdivision. You should have seen Janice's face at the last HOA meeting. Looked like she swallowed a lemon whole. Cornell didn't answer, just loaded another sack of feed into his cart. That evening, as the sun sank low, he drove past the marina. The docks stretched out across the water, weathered but steady, boats rocking gently in their slips. A few subdivision residents were down there, hauling coolers, chatting, preparing for the weekend. Cornell parked his truck and stepped onto the gravel path. Heads turned. Conversations trailed off. One man, mid-40s with a fishing pole slung over his shoulder, spoke first. Mr. Dupree, is it true? You own this place now. Cornell looked at him directly. That's right. The marina's mine. A ripple went through the group. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others muttered under their breath. Finally, a woman in a sun hat piped up. So what does that mean for us? We've been leasing slips here for years through the HOA. Cornell's voice was calm but firm. Nothing changes. Except who you pay. I'll keep the lease agreements fair, but this place is under my name now." There was silence, broken only by the soft slap of water against the docks. One man let out a low whistle. "Guess that makes you the landlord, then." Cornell didn't smile, didn't gloat. Call it what you want. But respect goes both ways. That's all I'll say. The following week, Cornell received a letter. Official HOA stationery, stamped and signed by none other than Janice Kettering. It accused him of interfering with community operations and demanded a meeting. Cornell folded it once, tucked it into his pocket, and decided to attend. The HOA meeting was held in the subdivision's clubhouse, a low brick building with fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs. By the time Cornell walked in, the room was packed. Janice sat at the head table, clipboard in front of her, lips pressed tight. "Mr. Dupree," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Care to explain why you've inserted yourself into subdivision property matters?" Cornell stood tall, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. "The Marina isn't subdivision property. It belonged to Mr. Lockhart. Now it belongs to me." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Janice slammed her palm against the table. "This is highly irregular. Residents have relied on this marina for decades under our management. You can't just swoop in and disrupt the system." Cornell's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't disrupt anything. I bought what was for sale. If you and your residents want access, the slips are available. Fair prices, same as before. Only difference is I'm the one signing the lease." An older man in the crowd raised his hand. "So you're not planning to kick us out?" "No," Cornell said evenly. "But I won't tolerate being treated like I don't belong." "That ends now." The room went quiet. Even Janice, who looked ready to argue again, struggled to find words. She finally settled on a glare that could curdle milk. Cornell left the meeting without another word. Outside, Franklin caught up to him. "You handled that well," he said. Cornell shrugged. "I didn't buy the marina to fight. I bought it to make a point." But Franklin shook his head. "Janice won't take this lying down. She's already stirring folks up, saying you're trying to take over." Cornell opened his truck door, his voice steady. "Let her stir. The deed's in my name. That's all that matters." As he drove back to the ranch, the headlights cutting across the dark road, Cornell felt the shift deep in his chest. He had gone from being humiliated on his own water to owning the very gateway his neighbors depended on. The balance had changed, and for the first time in weeks he felt his dignity restored. But power never changes hands without a fight, and Janice Kettering was already plotting her next move to rally the subdivision against him. It didn't take long for Janice Kettering to strike back. Within days of the HOA meeting, she sent out a flurry of emails to subdivision residents, warning that Cornell Dupree was a threat to community stability. She wrote that his purchase of the marina was a hostile takeover, and hinted at the possibility of rising costs and uncertain management. Cornell knew about the emails because one of them landed in his own mailbox, forwarded by Franklin Yates, who thought Cornell had a right to see what was being said. "Thought you should read this," Franklin's note said. Cornell sat at his kitchen table, Sharon leaning over his shoulder as he scrolled through the message. Janice had a way with words when she wanted to scare people. "We must protect our lake access. Mr. Dupree is not a subdivision resident, and his actions jeopardize the stability of our community resources." Sharon exhaled sharply. "She makes it sound like you're some kind of outlaw." Cornell closed the laptop. "She can write what she wants. I own the place. Paperwork speaks louder than emails." But Janice's campaign had an effect. The following Saturday, when Cornell drove down to the marina to check on the docks, a small crowd of residents was already gathered. They weren't there to fish or launch boats. They were there to protest. Handwritten signs waved in the air, "Save our marina," and "Stop the takeover." At the center stood Janice, clipboard in hand, riling them up like a conductor leading an orchestra. As Cornell stepped out of his truck, silence fell. Dozens of eyes turned toward him, some angry, some uncertain. Janice was the first to speak. "Well, well," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "The new landlord arrives. Care to explain to everyone here why you think you can swoop in and dictate our access?" Cornell stood tall, hands in his pockets. "I don't need to explain. I bought this marina. It was for sale. I made a legal purchase. A man in the crowd shouted, "What happens when you raise the lease fees? What if you shut us out?" Cornell's voice stayed even. "The fees will remain fair, and no one is being shut out. The only thing that's changed is who you write the check to. That's it." Janice raised her clipboard like it was evidence. "And what about accountability? At least with the HOA, residents had a say. With you, we have nothing but your word." Cornell took a step closer, his gaze steady. "What accountability did you show when you called the sheriff on me while I was on my own land? What accountability did you show when you spread lies about who owns the lake? Respect goes both ways, and you haven't given me any." The crowd shifted. A few murmured in agreement. Others crossed their arms, loyal to Janice's cause. One woman spoke up, her voice softer than the rest. "Mr. Dupree, if you promise not to take the marina away, why don't you put that in writing? Maybe then people would feel secure." Cornell nodded. "That's reasonable. I'll draft agreements for every leaseholder. Clear terms, no tricks." Janice's face reddened. "You can't just bypass the HOA like that." Cornell turned back to her, his voice firm. "I don't need your permission. The deed's in my name. You don't control this marina anymore, Janice. I do." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then someone in the back clapped, a slow, hesitant clap that grew louder as a few others joined. Not everyone applauded, but enough did to send Janice storming off the dock, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Cornell didn't celebrate. He simply turned, walked back to his truck, and drove home. But the message was clear. The battle lines were drawn. That evening, Sharon found him on the porch, watching the sunset over the lake. "You made a stand today," she said softly. Cornell shook his head. "I just told the truth. But Janice isn't finished. I could see it in her eyes. She's going to fight until she loses every inch of ground." Sharon sat beside him, resting her hand over his. "Then fight smart, because the whole neighborhood is watching now." Cornell looked out at the water, his reflection faint against the fading light. He knew Sharon was right. This wasn't just about a lake or a marina anymore. It was about dignity, and showing people that respect can't be stolen with lies or intimidation. But while Cornell had won the moment, the storm was only gathering strength, and the next move would force him to reveal exactly what kind of man he was. The subdivision clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax when Cornell walked in for the next HOA meeting. He hadn't been invited, Janice made sure of that, but Franklin called him the night before. "You'd better be there," Franklin had said. "She's twisting the story, making you out like some kind of tyrant. Folks need to hear your side." Cornell had thought about skipping it, about letting the paperwork speak for itself. But Sharon's voice echoed in his mind. "Fight smart." So he showed up, hat in hand, boots dusty from the ranch, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. The room was crowded, folding chairs filled, neighbors buzzing in low voices. At the front, Janice sat like a judge, clipboard stacked high with papers. Her smile tightened as she saw Cornell step in. "Well," she said into the microphone, "looks like Mr. Dupree decided to honor us with his presence." Cornell ignored the jab and found an empty chair. Franklin gave him a small nod from across the room. Janice began the meeting with her usual formality, rattling off maintenance updates and dues collection before turning the conversation. "As you all know, our community's marina has recently changed hands. Ownership was transferred to Mr. Cornell Dupree, who is not a subdivision resident. This has raised serious concerns about the future of our water access." Murmurs ran through the room. Some nodded, others frowned. Cornell stood. "Mind if I say something?" Janice pursed her lips. "We're not taking outside comments." But Franklin cut in. "He's not outside. He owns the marina. Let him speak." The room quieted, eyes turning toward Cornell. He stepped forward, voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent years working land with his hands. "I didn't come here to fight with anyone," he began. "I came to set the record straight. 2 weeks ago I was treated like a trespasser on my own lake. Deputies were called, neighbors watched, phones recorded. I showed my deed, and the matter was clear. But the damage was done. That's not something you forget." A man in the back called out, "So you bought the marina to get even?" Cornell shook his head. No, I bought the Marina because it was for sale, because I could, and because I wasn't going to let anyone write me out of a place I belong. You depend on that Marina. I know that. And I'm not here to take it away. He paused, letting the words sink in. The slips will stay open. Lease agreements will stay fair. What changes is this. Respect goes both ways. I won't tolerate being treated like I don't belong, and I won't let anyone else be treated that way either. You pay for a slip, you'll get what you paid for. No favoritism, no games, no hidden rules. A woman in the front row raised her hand. And if we can't afford increases down the road? HOA at least capped them? Cornell looked at her kindly. Then I'll work with folks. I'm not here to bleed anyone dry. I make my living from my ranch, not these slips. This isn't about money. It's about principle. The room was silent for a moment. Then an older man cleared his throat. Sounds fair to me. A few people clapped lightly. Others nodded. But not everyone was convinced. Janice leaned into the microphone, her voice sharp. Fine words, Mr. Dupree. But talk is cheap. What happens when the repairs pile up and you realize what a burden you've taken on? What happens when you get tired and sell to the highest bidder? Then where will we be? Cornell's gaze didn't flinch. You'll be where you are now, looking a man in the eye and hearing his word. You don't have to trust me yet. Trust takes time. But you'll see how I handle this Marina. You'll see I mean what I say. The room was quiet again, heavy with thought. Cornell continued, softer now. I didn't buy this place for revenge. I bought it to protect what's mine, and to remind everyone that dignity isn't a gift someone hands you. It's something you hold on to, no matter what. He let the words hang there, then stepped back. Even some of Janice's loyalists shifted uncomfortably. She shuffled her papers, trying to regain control, but the power in the room had shifted. Later, as people filed out, a few stopped to shake Cornell's hand. Appreciate you saying that, one man muttered. Another woman said, If you keep it fair, you'll have no trouble from me. Cornell thanked them quietly, walking out into the warm Texas night. Sharon was waiting in the truck, watching his face as he climbed in. Well? She asked. Cornell exhaled slowly. They heard me. Some of them, at least. Sharon smiled faintly. That's all it takes. One step at a time. Cornell looked back at the clubhouse lights glowing in the distance. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the crowd had listened. But listening was one thing, acceptance was another, and the real test of Cornell's word was still waiting just around the corner. The summer heat pressed heavy on the subdivision when the first new lease agreements went out under Cornell's name. Plain envelopes, typed neatly, with terms that were straightforward and clear. No hidden fees, no surprise increases, just fair prices spelled out in black and white. At first there was hesitation. Some residents dragged their feet, hoping Janice would swoop in with a miracle plan. But as the weeks passed, one by one, they signed. Boats needed a place to stay, and the Marina wasn't going anywhere. Cornell kept to his word. He hired a local crew to patch the docks and reinforce the supports. The work was loud and dusty, saws buzzing and hammers clanging, but slowly the place began to look sturdier. Fishermen noticed, families noticed. Even those who doubted him had to admit the repairs were more progress than the HOA had managed in years. One afternoon, while supervising the crew, Cornell spotted Franklin strolling down the dock with his usual fishing pole. Looks better already? Franklin said, gesturing at the fresh planks. Haven't seen this kind of work here since the 90s. Cornell smiled faintly. Figured if I'm going to own it, might as well take care of it. Franklin chuckled. Funny how that works, isn't it? Ownership makes a man serious. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. And between you and me, Janice ain't been the same since that meeting. Folks are starting to ask whether she's really got the community's best interests at heart. Cornell didn't gloat. He just nodded. People will see what they need to see. But that evening, as he drove back to the ranch, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The same neighbors who once watched him be humiliated on the water were now depending on him for their access. Not through shouting, not through lawsuits, just through steady action. The change didn't come easy. Janice made one last push, filing a complaint with the county, arguing that Cornell's ownership was against community covenants. But the county clerk dismissed it almost immediately. The deed was clear, the sale legal. Cornell received the notice in the mail, tucked it into a drawer, and never spoke of it again. Weeks rolled into months. By late summer, the marina looked transformed. Fresh paint, reinforced docks, even a new set of lights that glowed soft at night. Families started gathering again, laughing and casting lines, kids chasing each other down the pier. The anger and suspicion that once filled the air began to fade. One evening, as the sun dipped orange over the lake, Cornell stood by his truck watching the crowd. A woman he recognized, one who had shouted at him during the protest, walked up, hesitant. "Mr. Dupree," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. My husband and I thought you were going to push us out. But you've been fair. More than fair. We were wrong." Cornell studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'm not here to push anyone out. Never was." She smiled faintly, then walked back toward her family. Cornell climbed into his truck, the lake shimmering in his rear-view mirror. For the first time since that day the deputies pulled up, he felt the weight lift. Not because Janice had lost, but because dignity had been restored. Not only his own, but the kind that comes when truth and patience outlast noise. At home, Sharon sat on the porch swing as he joined her. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Looks like they finally understand." Cornell looked out over the water, stars starting to prick the sky. "Took time, took work, but respect's not something you demand. It's something you show. And once you show it, even the loudest voices can't drown it out." Sharon squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. "So, you got what you wanted?" Cornell let the quiet linger before answering. "Not what I wanted. What was right." But while the lake had settled into peace, the lesson stretched far beyond those waters, leaving a mark on everyone who watched how one man turned humiliation into quiet strength. By the time fall rolled in, the subdivision had adjusted to its new reality. Lease payments were steady, the marina ran smoother than it had in years, and even the staunchest critics had run out of ammunition. People who once whispered behind their phones now nodded politely when Cornell passed by. Some even struck up conversations, asking about the ranch, asking about cattle feed or weather, as though he had been part of their circle all along. Janice Kettering, however, never softened. She kept her seat as HOA president, but her sway had diminished. At meetings, where she once commanded silence with a glare, people now challenged her. They reminded her that her authority had limits, and nothing reminded her of that more than the sight of Cornell's name on every slip lease signed by her neighbors. Cornell never rubbed it in. He didn't brag. He didn't throw her humiliation back in her face. That wasn't his way. Instead, he went about his work, running the marina with the same quiet discipline he used to tend his ranch. Over time, people saw the truth. The man who had been called a trespasser was the one keeping their boats afloat. One Saturday evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Cornell sat at the marina office with Sharon. They watched families pack up their coolers, kids running down the docks, dogs barking at the water. The air was alive with the easy joy of people at peace. Sharon looked at him, her eyes warm. "You turned the tables without shouting, without fighting. You just let your actions speak. That's why they respect you now." Cornell smiled faintly, rubbing his calloused hands together. "Respect's not a trophy someone hands you. It's built brick by brick. I didn't buy this place to own people. I bought it to prove a point. No one decides your worth but you." Sharon nodded, leaning into him. "And you proved it." A knock on the office door interrupted them. Franklin Yates poked his head in, hat in hand. "Evening, Cornell. Just wanted to say thanks for keeping things steady around here. Folks might not admit it out loud, but they're grateful. Whole place feels different now." Cornell stood, shaking Franklin's hand. "Appreciate that. I didn't set out to change the place. Just wanted to stand my ground." Franklin chuckled. "Well, you did more than that. You gave folks an example. Sometimes the best revenge is just doing right." As Franklin left, Cornell sank back into his chair, his heart calm. The memory of the sirens, the stairs, and Janice's accusations still lingered, but they no longer cut deep. They had been replaced by something stronger. Proof that patience and principle could outlast hostility. Later that night, Cornell and Sharon sat on their porch at the ranch. The crickets sang, and the lake shimmered under the moon. Cornell spoke softly, almost to himself. They tried to take my dignity with a phone call, tried to humiliate me in front of neighbors. But look how it turned out. You don't beat noise with more noise, you beat it with persistence, with truth, with quiet strength. Sharon slipped her hand into his. And maybe that's the lesson everyone needed to see. Cornell nodded slowly. Maybe it is. The story of Cornell Dupree didn't spread across the country or make headlines on national news, but it didn't need to. For those who lived it, and for those who watched it unfold from across the water, it carried a truth they wouldn't forget. Real power isn't in loud voices or false authority. It's in steady action, in refusing to bend when you know you're right. So if you've ever been humiliated, written off, or told you don't belong, remember Cornell's story. Remember how one man turned embarrassment into a quiet victory. And remember this: dignity doesn't come from the approval of others. It comes from how you carry yourself when the world is watching. If this story struck a chord with you, take a moment to think about what it means in your own life. And if you want more stories that show how everyday people stand tall against challenges, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because lessons like this are worth remembering.